equation. If you joined us for the first part of this webinar series, you know Jean and Sam as experts on Climate Week. That certainly helped me prepare to understand what I was looking at during that busy week. If you are joining us new, I'll do some brief introductions. We are joined by Jean Rogers. She was the founder of SASB, a leading ESG thinker on the board of several companies, advising on sustainability, including advising Amenity on our sustainability product line. And Sam Levitt, who is our head of ESG content at Amenity. He's a graduate of Bard's Sustainability MBA program. His job is to think about all of the ESG stories that are going on in the world, and he does that very well. If you haven't, you can see his weekly blog posts on our blog, or today you can hear him describe some of the analysis of what actually happened during Climate Week. Really excited for today's conversation. What we're going to do is begin with a bit of an open dialogue over some of the headline items that stood out during Climate Week, and then we'll dive into a deck that will leverage our new materiality dashboards to help you understand some of the insights and some of the specific language of commitments that companies made during this week. But let's open with a little bit of conversation for our panelists today. And I guess the first question is quite broad. Did anything stand out to you during Climate Week? Personally, and I'll jump into this in a bit of a second, I think one of the interesting developments was a trend that we've seen over the past few years of the importance of state actors, both on the national and local level, mixing with companies to advance carbon goals, sometimes in coordination, sometimes in their own verticals. But that was an interesting trend that I noted. Jean, was there anything that stood out to you?
I think that's right, Bennett. And I think we continue to see the pace and the scale of the corporate commitments increase during Climate Week, pushing more into scope 3, going deeper. And I think we also saw commitment to science-based targets, more prevalence of that preference, both for companies themselves and really pushing that out into the supply chain. So going deeper and supporting those commitments with evidence and with science-based targets.
Science-based targets and a lot of money as well. We saw, I think one of the more notable commitments was the CFO task force, the one associated with the UN Global Compact that pledged, I think it was $500 billion over the next 5 years. So a relatively short time frame for that allocation of CapEx. That's 60 companies. Again, sort of putting a number and more in that investment category of materiality to the commitments that we've been seeing over the past several years.
That's right. It's great to see that, because I think we really are at an inflection point where people are beginning to understand that the energy transition takes a sustained focus. It takes an actual commitment with resources allocated against it, and to see that CFO commitment really recognizing that this is in their area. They're going to need to come up with smart CapEx strategies and figure out how to finance it, whether it's against free cash flow or corporate bonds, green bonds, or other mechanisms. That's what we have to be thinking about for these net zero commitments and these long-term commitments. There has to be an allocation of capital against it, or it's not. It's hard to know how a company is going to actually meet that target. So it was great to see more of that in the conversation, that acknowledgement of the expenditures.
Yeah, I think one of the issues that was top of mind was equity when it comes to climate. I think companies are incentivized to make those investments within their own strategic verticals. Very clearly, there's a need for non-company actors involved in this as well. And President Biden made a notable commitment around financial support for low-income countries. Although we're looking at a commitment of $11 billion that still has to get through Congress versus that $500 billion investment here. So I spent a little time just making sure I understood those two numbers correctly and sort of the scale of the challenge when we're thinking about how much money is actually going to be required, and how we're going to track those investments.
It is. I think in some ways the 11 billion certainly is. It's symbolic. It's more of a recognition that we need to think about emerging markets and countries that are perhaps less able to afford decarbonization solutions. Because when you look at the scale of what is required to decarbonize, Morgan Stanley estimated 50 trillion. It could be upwards north of that, up to 100 trillion to actually decarbonize. So the magnitude of that commitment compared to what it's really going to take to decarbonize the world's economy, it's not where it needs to be, but it's a start. And I think as a symbolic gesture, it's really important to recognize the equity in that gesture, that this is not just putting net zero targets onto countries that are still developing, and while the developed world kind of continues to pollute. It's something that we all need to do together. So I think that was a really important gesture. It's clearly not going to be the way that we decarbonize. It will be actually companies kind of understanding really how to do this smartly, financed well, and with the right flow of initiatives. There's a smart way to do this, as we talked last time, and that's what we look for kind of in really good climate commitments, which is, really goes back to the work of Amory Lovins and Rocky Mountain Institute. I have to give them a shout out. They were really the first to think through the hierarchy of energy efficiency, which is, of course, at the core of carbon intensity, carbon reduction, and the hierarchy, which just makes complete intuitive sense, of decarbonization is really like, don't emit it if you don't have to. Don't use the energy if you don't have to. That's where you start, conservation. So we look for companies actually talking about those initiatives to conserve energy. Working from home and other types of hybrid work arrangements actually reduce energy efficiency. That would be the first step. And then once you've actually reduced that demand, then moving towards renewables and thinking about how you supply that energy load that you need. And how can you integrate renewables into your energy source, especially relying on the ones that are already at price parity, wind, solar, maybe thinking about battery storage. But we look first to the renewables that are already at price parity with their carbon intensive brethren. We need to be really maximizing the use of wind and solar. And then moving towards more exotics, hydrogen, carbon capture, the things that are still in the R&D phase. Well, they're proven technologies, but they're not deployed at scale because they're not yet economical. And so those, we would expect still to be in R&D, not to jump straight to them. And of course, only as a last resort, moving to offsets, because the whole idea is that actually that we're reducing carbon. And so again, that's the hierarchy that we would look for. That's the really smart hierarchy. That's the way to do it economically. And of course, as a public company, you need to be thinking about that. So I'm curious to see what Sam thinks if we kind of saw that in the disclosures, but that would be, that hierarchy underpinned by milestones, and then tied to a smart capex strategy. That's really the way to do a long-term net zero commitment, and what we would be looking for over time in the disclosure. So it'll be interesting to see what we saw in the disclosures.
Perfect. Well, why delay any longer? Let's get into the meat of it. I think that's probably the perfect transition to have you lead the show, Sam, and share a little bit of what our platform surfaced regarding some of those themes, or some of those novel themes that might have come up during this year's Climate Week.
Sure. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. All right. Can we see the slideshow?
We can indeed.
Looks good.
All right. So thank you for joining us. My name is Sam Levitt. I'm the ESG analyst for Amenity. This is a graphic of our materiality model output for the entire market over time. We can see that there's a bit of a spike in commitments and investments, as well as company exposure and milestones preceding Climate Week. And then it actually takes a bit of a dip here. So, a lot of the, marketing and messaging for companies actually happened before Climate Week this year, but still a lot of interesting stuff that we're going to dig into that occurred in the past few weeks. Just by an ESG topics comparison, before we dig into environmental, there was one social element that we really saw uptick from August and September in 2020 to this year. Data security became a big issue, most likely due to the SolarWinds hack and some of the other cybersecurity issues that we saw with large companies in the past few months. So just from a social standpoint, this was really an emerging trend that we saw. As we dig into the environmental topics, we saw, some of the ones you would expect to see increase in discussion. Carbon emissions, renewable energy all had increased mentions on our topics dashboard. But some of the other ones that we wanted to focus on here really, wind, carbon intensity, and battery storage went from having almost no conversation in 2020 to having a pretty robust volume of conversation this year. So to start with carbon intensity, this is a new buzzword we've been seeing used mainly by oil and gas companies. It denotes lower carbon use and is really an efficiency measure rather than absolute reduction. This seems like a good place for you to jump in, Dean.
Let me just jump in and say that carbon intensity is actually a measure of efficiency, and obviously it comes from the energy efficiency underpinning the carbon emissions and the type of energy. But this is what we would expect to see along the journey as one of the first steps in the transition is an extreme focus on efficiency to really eke out really lower that demand. So I think it's a positive thing that we're actually seeing a focus on this type of language that reflects efficiency metrics, carbon intensity and energy efficiency.
Especially in some industries where net zero is probably only going to be achieved through offsets, if we're being realistic. So especially in those sectors, making yourself as efficient as possible so that offset component of a net zero goal, which is really how we sort of have to start looking at these, is as low as possible, should be looked upon favorably.
That's absolutely right, and we would expect to see more of this in the hard to abate sectors because it's only economically feasible to think about net zero if you eke absolutely everything out of the energy use and sort of on the demand side. So I think this is a positive development. We'll see how it develops, but this would be a logical and economical first step to really be focused on efficiency.
Chevron and Carnival, haven't necessarily been included in ESG indices, arguably, nor should they be, right? But because of a growing approach to investing, where it's not just exclusionary based, right? We want to think about companies that are investing in strategic ways, material to their business lines, that differentiate them from their peers. Maybe they are more attractive because of some of these efficiency investments that we're seeing here.
That's right. And, I want to just pick up on that point, Bennett, because it's really important to remember that decarbonization of our economy and society depends on these hard to abate industries actually making the investments to decarbonize. It's not feasible just to jump to offsets, and it's also not desirable. We need these industries to actually do the hard work, do the investment to decarbonize, and we need investors to support that. My worry about investors making net zero portfolio commitments, which also many have, is that they will do that by simply shifting to FANG stocks and to already carbon light tech industries, which actually doesn't, sort of business as usual, it's not actually decarbonizing our economy. So we need this kind of focus. We need more of this. We need more focus on efficiency and intensity, particularly in the hard to abate industries. This is a very important first step
for that engagement. And this is a really interesting trend that we're seeing here, where there's sort of some new language being used this year versus last year around efficiency, specifically carbon intensity. Sam, are you back with us and stable?
I think so. Can you hear me now?
We can, yes.
Okay, perfect. So sorry about that. Moving on, we also saw an uptick in battery storage being discussed as something companies are now investing in. Before it was really a prototype technology, and we see the typical energy companies like Enel Green and El Paso Electric. Some of these companies using battery storage for the first time. We also have Rio Tinto, the mining company, using it for operations too. So it's not just your typical energy companies, but also operations in some of these far-flung regions to replace diesel generators, possibly.
And I think this, interestingly, Sam, this also reflects this movement towards really fully being able to utilize the existing portfolio of renewables that are already at price parity, and that would be wind and solar. But we know we need to really address the storage issues and make sure that energy, that is produced when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing, can be used at other times and in other places. So looking at battery storage in the grid and just really making sure that we can maximize the use of those renewable technologies that are already at cost parity is the important next step after efficiency. So it's really interesting that you're seeing this commitment to storage. It's great to see.
I think you also can sort of pick up that there must be some tailwinds here, in part from that public-private partnership that we were discussing, whether that's some of the national infrastructure plans. As a New Yorker, I was probably most in tune to our governor's announcement of the new transmission line projects for increasing the use for solar and wind energy and strengthening the grid. So as we see some of those tailwinds around improving the infrastructure and a greater realization across the wider market and the common public that these are important components to that stable energy system, that it creates really interesting opportunities for these companies that, as Sam said, we might not traditionally think about, that have focused on energy storage, but they're now seeing that it makes economic sense to spend that money.
Definitely. And then, the last topic we really saw uptick in, surprisingly, there was not that much conversation about it last year, but wind farms really, took off. There's a lot of development in England, off the coast, in the North Sea, in Europe. In the US, we just approved our first offshore wind farm in Massachusetts over the summer. And then Laos and Southeast Asia, there's been some projects in Vietnam. So we've seen a lot more CapEx involved for wind projects, and it's not just energy companies, but companies like Mitsubishi and HSBC purchasing power purchase agreements to offset some of their operational carbon costs. So this has really been a topic we've seen take off in the past year to 6 months.
I think, again, that harkens back to the framework you were speaking about, Gene, of where we want to see companies spending their money, whether it's in efficiency or in those technologies that are at price parity. Wind is one that has reached that greater price parity, especially over the last year. So I think in terms of those trends, it makes sense that we're seeing some of these purchase power agreements specifically focused on that dimension.
And also really interesting to see the direct investment by corporations, not just investments by energy companies, but actually thinking about moving to that next step of investing in renewables and securing that renewable energy supply and enhancing energy independence by directly investing in renewables that are at price parity.
Well, one thing you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation today was that we're seeing sort of a trend towards companies being more aware of scope 3 emissions, of supply chain emissions. Again, all of that factors into having more awareness of their energy supply and not just necessarily reducing the total amount of energy, certainly important, but understanding where all of the energy is coming from. Actually quite a challenging question, not necessarily the subject of today's conversation, but a note in line with the observation of the specific investments in wind.
That's right, and taking control of it in a way that I think is, a more emerging strategy for corporates to really think about securing that energy supply themselves, rather than just perhaps negotiating with their utility or just taking whatever the grid is producing. Really going out and securing a supply of renewable energy is something we're seeing more of.
Right. And then, moving on, we wanted to take a look at two companies that had some really interesting investments and initiatives in the most recent Climate Week, and kind of backtrack and look at their profile and see how they got to this point. So one company that we saw come up on our platform was Walmart. They issued a $2 billion green bond for their sustainability efforts. And if we go back last year during Climate Week, they committed to zero global emissions by 2040. And even before that, they had renewable commitments as far back as 2018. And they were already supplying power with PPAs for those initiatives. So, a $2 billion green bond is, big chunk of change. But Walmart has been, doing this for a while. They also have some supply chain initiatives around beef and sustainable agriculture. And then, another one we saw.
Sam, before we go on,
do we want to touch on?
Yeah, I guess Gene and I both want to. I'll go briefly with an observation here, which is
sure.
Just to contextualize for the audience what you're seeing. This is the news volume associated with either commitments, investments, exposures, or milestones over time. So you have to think about this in terms of perception and what makes a good news story to a certain extent, right, from external news. And last year, when we had the big 2040 goal, it got a lot of buzz, but was perhaps lacking on some specificity. So it's important to always then, even if you don't see the article in pretty much every major publication, to stay on top of developing news like this green bond, like their sustainable agriculture initiatives. We're always going to show you the detailed data in the platform, but you also can understand the trend of perception here as well. Gene, I didn't want to interrupt you, but did you have a different observation?
Well, just that this represents a really important investment in thinking about smart finance. And obviously, I love to see the green bond strategy, because that's just a really smart way to finance decarbonization. Obviously, keeping that weighted average cost of capital down and taking advantage of the financial instruments that are out there to support decarbonization. And just, great to see that focus on financing the transition. And, so something like that obviously gets a lot of press, but it's really important not only to look at the press around commitments, because actually the hard work of decarbonizing is seen in the investment line and in the milestones line, the gray lines, and they may not scale in terms of media exposure, but they're absolutely critical to track as an investor to understand if those commitments have substance and are still actually on the radar of companies that make them.
Right. And the next company that we're looking at also, very similar, where there's a lot of commitments, and then we see a little more specificity in their spend recently with this most recent Climate Week. So Ford is one of these legacy auto companies that's been trying to catch up with Tesla in the electric vehicle arena. Most recently, they spend $50 million investing in Redwood Materials, a battery recycling company. And then, in previous months and years, we see these huge commitments for electrification, but not as much specificity in these investments. They also have a partner with Volkswagen on EV module technology, and they do invest in Rivian back in April 2019. But we can see from their exposure, they got the most exposure for investments with this most recent announcement of their investment in Redwood Materials during Climate Week.
Makes sense with the trend we saw across the market in terms of the focus on battery storage, increased focus on electrification. I mean, significant capital outlay here and that commitment to electrification. So 50 million is a relatively small portion of that, but strategically thinking about where you can get the most bang for your buck is, I think, one of the exercises that a good analyst or investment portfolio manager has to do when thinking about these firms. And battery recycling, as we think about a circular supply chain, is going to be one of the larger challenges for EVs. So it's good to see Ford investing in something that's like strategic to their business line in that fashion.
And we also see the bigger numbers around electrification and electric vehicles. And we're beginning to see that with Ford, with the whole product line transforming the F-150 trucks, the Mustangs now that are under development. And actually, I think, where you can order them now, but these are the digital versions of these analog muscle cars now being designed for a new market, and so that's putting that capital to work in their product lineup.
And paying dividends as well. I mean, we'll see how Rivian IPOs, but that potentially could be a nice set of stock in Ford's book as well. Sort of a curious quirk of the financial markets, but again, a conversation for another day. Sam, I think we have
and Rivian also already out with their trucks.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Sam, did you have a couple of wrap ups there? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just to wrap up this topic on Ford here. There's also a regulatory component too, where like a state like Illinois just passed a law that they'll be phasing out fossil fuels. Some other countries are outlawing internal combustion engines. So the regulatory environment is really setting up a scenario where these companies need to adapt as well. And then just for a few takeaways to wrap all this up, we saw an increased focus on cybersecurity from a social lens. This was really something that took off after the SolarWinds hack and some of the other cyber data breaches we saw. Wind development and battery storage have gained prominence as real investment grade opportunities for some of these companies. And lastly, the phrase carbon intensity has emerged when discussing lower carbon solutions like carbon capture. And that's just a new word we've seen. It's important to know what that means. So I'm going to turn this back over to Bennett, who will be leading the conversation from here.
Oh, thanks, Sam. I think that was quite interesting in terms of seeing some of those trends. Can you see the dashboards here? Okay, perfect. While you were doing that conversation and the discussion on the importance of milestones, I just brought up Salesforce here as an example of a company that recently hit some of those impressive milestones. Oh gosh, I think wrong screen. Let me just pull that around to my other one. The joys of presenting. And I think, oh, okay, there we go.
There it is.
You're now seeing the correct insights here, where we saw Salesforce with some impressive milestones. So notably, making one of the more impactful, I think, Climate Week commitments that we saw and Climate Week statements, where we tagged a significant amount of pollution management and clean technology insights as milestones, where they achieved net zero carbon emissions across scope 1, 2, and 3 of their operations. So being very specific there in the specific channels that they noted, as well as launching Sustainability Cloud, so a new product that would be strategic again to their business line to help thinking about how you can provide that carbon footprint data as one of your product offerings. But the note that I want to make, and I think Sam described this when showing some of the trends that we saw over the past year, is that while Climate Week might have the heaviest amount of news, certainly for national and local politicians, as well as then companies that have treated it similar to Earth Week, we're seeing this happen all the time, and there are new commitments that are coming out daily. So you can leverage some of our dashboards and tools, whether through an email alert, whether through the dashboard itself, to get insight. When, for example, just this morning, we saw Fortescue Metals, a company that I think we spoke about on our last webinar in prep for Climate Week, that committed to net zero scope 3 emissions by 2040. They previously made commitments that were more specific to scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. And this is happening all the time, where we're seeing companies that are refreshing their sustainability strategy, that are describing new commitments to sustainability that they want to make, whether that's in their earnings calls, whether that's in press releases, or whether that's in news. As investors, as companies, as analysts or consultants, the variety of audiences that we have today, it's very important to try and stay on top of that. Hopefully some of this conversation today will help you stay on top of what actually happened during Climate Week, and give you some insight into how you can stay on top of it moving forward.
Well, and Bennett, just maybe a note about a forward-looking note, which is that also during Climate Week, the SEC also released a template for comment letters. And comment letters are the letters that the SEC writes to companies about their filings and sort of raises issues or concerns or observations that the SEC has in terms of the way a company is conveying its material issues in its 10K or other filings. So the comment letters is a first step for the SEC to raise a concern. And they have released a template for how they will begin to review filings with respect to climate disclosures. And it's a very important release because it's a window into how the SEC is thinking about good disclosure on climate. And it's actually very comprehensive. And a couple of things to point, you can find this document online. From the SEC, it's the sample comment letter on climate change disclosure. So they expect to be reviewing filings and looking generally at whether you are consistent between your CSR report and your regulated filing through the SEC to investors. That's very, very important, not to say things in your CSR report that could be material that are not actually in your filings, because material information must be disclosed in your filings. They also expect risk factors to be improved in terms of disclosing material effects of transition risks, including access to capital. And then MD&A, which of course is known trends and uncertainties. Certainly climate change is one of those. And it's very interesting, the specificity with which the SEC has talked about the kinds of things they would like to see in there, including changes in the regulatory landscape, as Sam mentioned, including identifying any material capital expenditures for climate-related projects. Very, very important. And then, of course, looking at the other types of trends on impacts on the operating condition or the financial performance of the company, including business continuity issues or products and markets. So they also actually want disclosure about the purchase or sale of carbon credits or offsets on the business. That's sort of the last one that snuck in there. And of course, I love that the SEC is acknowledging that that could be a very expensive way to achieve your net zero carbon strategy. So maybe you want to think about that. And if you're doing that, certainly you need to disclose that. So great to see this comment letter and template. And I think this is what is going to guide disclosure going forward in the filings. So we'll meet here same time next year and see if what we're seeing in the disclosures is actually now more closely cueing to what the SEC is kind of recognizing.
Yep, I think that's a great note. It's the importance of a variety of different types of content analyzed to understand and adequately benchmark these firms on things like materiality, on things like authenticity, greenwashing, all topics of conversation that are frequent in our weekly ESG blogs. If you haven't signed up for that, I'd encourage you to. It sounds like there's probably a couple follow-up webinars to this conversation that we'll have to schedule. So if you're on those lists, we'll be sure to let you know. And I think that's wrapping up our time for today. So we might have gone a little over actually, but it was a great conversation. Didn't want to cut it short. And I appreciate everyone for sticking with us and joining today. And for Jean and Sam, as always, your insightful comments on the trends that we're seeing in sustainability. Really, really great to have you both.
Thanks, Bennett. Thanks, Sam. Great to see everyone.
Yeah. Thank you, Jean. Thank you, Bennett.
Go forth and be carbon neutral. See everybody.